Hello, my name is Aida Kaiwa, and I will be presenting Lab 4, the second hack, part 1. The objectives here was to conduct enumeration, to scan, analyze, and present the vulnerability findings. From there, I formulated a hypothesis, specified the attack vectors, and even dived into the legal, ethical, and industry standards for vulnerability disclosure. The tools I used throughout this was Nmap for the host discovery, NICTO, OWASP, SAP, and Nessus for vulnerability scanning. So let's get into it. Alrighty, so starting off here, I'm going to be touching on a few concepts in the next few slides, just to provide you that basis of understanding of each one. So I will be beginning by comparing the NICTO and the OWASP SAP. And they are both web security tools, but they do have their differences in their own ways. So starting off with NICTO, it is a command line tool that scans web servers to quickly find the known issues like outdated services, risky files, and configuration weaknesses. It then does give quick high-level results to an organization and is simple to automate. Another thing to mention is that HackVisor, according to HackVisor, it is an open source web server scanner that performs vulnerability scanning against web servers for multiple items, including dangerous files and programs. So the next one here is that there is the OWASP SAP. So it is a full web application security testing platform with a graphical interface, and it does dive deeper than the NICTO, and it helps to support active scanning, spidering, fuzzing, and session handling. It also has features such as like the built-in proxy that lets testers capture and modify web traffic, so that makes it more effective for manually examining issues like CSRF and XSS. However, keep in mind that OWASP is more resource intensive, so it will make it slower. So now we're going to go into the strengths of NICTO. So strengths of NICTO is that it's fast scanning, so it does do a really good job of quickly checking web servers for their known vulnerabilities. Then there's also the fact that it's simple to use. It is also good for baseline assessments. It's also automable, so it works really well with automated workflows. And it's very low resource usage that it has, so it's lightweight and doesn't really need a lot of system power. Now when for OWASP, it has that deep application testing, so it does go beyond just basic server checks to find application layer issues. There's also the fact that it's easier to navigate visually because it has that full-featured GUI. Then there's also that proxy for it as well. So the intercepting proxy actually helps with the manual traffic inspection that it needs. And it's also really good for XSS and CSRF testing. There's also that spidering and active scan, session handling, fuzzing support, and it also has a better verification workflow. Another thing here is that there's the weaknesses aspect. So NICTO, it is more surface level scanning, it's high noise, provides false positives, there's no proxy, and it's not ideal for hands-on investigation. OWASP, it's slower because of it being so resource intensive, and it's more complicated to use or navigate. And the last thing that I would be mentioning is that there is an option to utilize both, since they can both attribute their own strengths that can be beneficial to an organization overall. For instance, NICTO is very successful when it comes to detecting basic server vulnerabilities quickly, while OWASP digs further and offers hands-on analysis of web application weaknesses. All right, so CSRF, what it stands for is it's a cross-site request forgery. And what this is that it is a web security vulnerability that allows an attacker to induce users to perform actions that they do not intend to perform, according to Portswigger. So how it works is the user is being tricked into opening a page that behind the scenes sends forged requests to the site using their session cookies. So there are 3 conditions. So it does work under 3 conditions, and one of them is relevant action. So a relevant action exists. And this is when there's an action the attacker wants the user to perform. So that could be you changing your password, altering permissions, and so on. Another one is cookie-based sessions only. So the app authenticates requests solely via session cookies. So forged requests use the victim's session. Next one is the no unpredictable request parameters. So the request contains not really like a secret or unpredictable values the attacker can't guess, and that could be like your current password. So the last thing here is to prevent a CSRF, adding unique tokens for each session or form and check them on the server. You can use same site cookies, or you can ask users to re-authenticate before performing sensitive actions. Next, I have XSS, and it is known as cross-site scripting. So this is a web security vulnerability that allows an attacker to compromise the interactions that users have with a vulnerable application, according to Portswigger. So there are different types here. One of the types is reflected XSS. So this is malicious script that comes from the current HTTP request. Next one is stored XSS. This one, malicious script that comes from this website's database. And the next one is a DOM-based XSS, and this is the vulnerability exists in the client-side code rather than the server-side code. So all of this is according, of course, to Portswigger. And the impact here is that it can cause defacement. It can result to the stealing of your data, phishing, and even data exfiltration. So there's a lot of different things that it can cause. And then last thing over here, the last two things, there is the testing process. So the testing of this can be done through OWASP SAP's active scan along with a manual injection. Another way to go about it is through simple payloads. And some mitigation techniques that you can consider here is CSP, having just HTTP only cookies, encoding, and so on. All right, so in the next few slides, I will be jumping into the enumeration process that I did during this lab. So here I had started by scanning the subnet, which was the 192.168.56.0, and then of course the /24 to find the active host. So 3 devices responded, as you can see here in the screenshot. We have the 192.168.56.1. It has a UPnP and the AFS file server open. We have the 192.168.56.3. This is our main target, which is the key objects toolbox as well. It has the SSH, ATTP, HTTPS, RPC bind, IPP, and MySQL services running on it. We also have the 192.168.56.2. This would be the Kali, and it has no open ports, as you can see. So this does give us a clear view of the live host, and it also provides which services we can further explore for our vulnerabilities. So command number 2, here I ran an OS detection. So scan on the IP address identified in the previous slide, which was the 192.168.56.3. So this was the nmap. Of course, it has the -O and then 192.168.56.3. So here I'm just focusing on, of course, the key objects toolbox for this lab. And as shown here, it is confirming for me that the host is a Linux machine running kernel 2.6.x. And then we have open ports. So here I'm seeing that we're having open ports such as the SSH, ATTP, HTTPS, RPC bind, IPP, and the MySQL. So being able to understand this lets me know that the host OS and services, which can be helpful when it comes to targeting the right scans and exploits. So the next command here that I did was the nmap with the --top -ports 30 192.168.56.3. So this provided the top 30 ports on for the 192.168.56.3 IP address, and I can see it tells me that the host has SSH, HTTP, HTTPS, RPC bind, and MySQL open, while other common ports like the FTP, Telnet, and SMB are closed. So overall, this is showing me the active services that I should focus on during vulnerability scans. All right, so now here I ran an XMS scan on 192.168.56.3. The ports shown here, like SSH, HTTP, HTTPS, RPC bind, IPP, and MySQL, showed up as, again, of course, open or filtered. This is letting me know that they are active or they're being protected by a firewall. So again, this offers me insight into which services are reachable and how the network is being protected. Next up, I tried a different command here. I then performed a service version scan on 192.168.56.3, and this came out to be the nmap, then -s, of course, uppercase V with the 192.168.56.3 here command. And this gave me the services running, such as the SSH, Apache, again the HTTP and the HTTPS, RPC bind, IPP, and MySQL, along with specific versions for each one. So here I am seeing there are open ports and services. So 22, there's SSH, and it's showing me open SSH 3.9 P1. We have port 80, which is the HTTP, Apache 2.0.52 on CentOS. We have the 111 with the RPC bind, 443 with HTTPS, with the Apache 2.0.52 on CentOS. There's also the 631 port, which is with IPP. Then we have the CUPS 1.1. And then there's also the 3306 with the MySQL, and then that's part of the unauthorized access. So overall, this is helping me to highlight areas of weaknesses for each service. All right, so in this scan, I used the command nmap -p- with the hyphen capitalized A 192.168.56.3 to perform a full TCP port and service detection scan on the target system. So the scan actually confirmed, again, of course, that the host is online, but now it's telling me that it is running an older Linux kernel around version 2.6. Once again, of course, I'm seeing that the main services that are active, including the SSH port 22 with the HTTP, HTTPS on the ports 80 and 443, and then MySQL on port 3306. So I was able to find more information with this scan, and then I also found some issues as well here. So I could spot that SSH is using version 1, which is outdated, which makes it insecure. Then we have the Apache web server that is also quite old, and I could see that a certificate dating back to 2010, which makes it expired. And lastly, I noticed the presence of the SSL v2, which leaves the system susceptible to known security vulnerabilities. Next up, I ran the nmap's vulnerability scripts against 192.168.56.3. So here I actually ran the command nmap -P n, then -- script vulnerability with a VULN 192.168.56.3. So here I was able to get a ton of information, which was great. The first issues I identified are a potential CSRF vulnerability on the login form. I also found HTTP trace that's being enabled and exposed directory listings. So overall, these are all application level risks. A serious TLS problems were found, so CCS injection, logjam, weak DH groups, and poodle. So this all leaves the opportunity for attackers to intercept the traffic. There's also potential vulnerability to slow ORS, the DOS on this server as well. So now that I went through the enumeration process, I did do a few scans, which I'll be discussing here in the next few slides. Here I did a NICTO scan. So that scanned the web server at 192.168.56.3. And I also found it's running Apache 2.0.52 with PHP 4.3.9, which are both outdated. I also saw that a few critical security headers were missing here. So these were like the headers such as X-frame options and X-content type options here. This can leave actually the server vulnerable to MIME attacks and even clickjacking. Another thing here is that the server also has the HTTP trace active and has exposed directories like /manual, / and /icons, and that has sensitive information on it, including the wp config.php. So from all of this information, the results indicated that there were multiple areas of concern in this server and application configuration that should be corrected. Here I did an OWASP ZAP scan that ran on the IP address 192.168.56.3. Here you can see a bunch of different tabs with a bunch of information that was included in it, such as the alerts tab, output, spider, active scan, and all the information that it included. So it did use a traditional spider method with Firefox to analyze and crawl the accessible pages. It also gave me quite a few security issues, and it did find that the most high risk here is the SQL injection vulnerability in the login page affecting the username parameter. This can mean that the intruder can manipulate a database by injecting the SQL commands, which can then lead them to gaining that unauthorized access to the system. OWASP also identified missing security headers like content security policy and the clickjacking headers. It also didn't have the anti-CSRF tokens, so this makes the system more vulnerable to attacks like forgery, clickjacking, and so on. So overall, it showed me all the different common web security weaknesses, and it let me know how essential it is to have secure coding practices and the right security controls at both the server and client level. So next up, I did a Nessus scan. Nessus is an automated scanner that checks systems vulnerabilities and misconfigurations. It identifies open ports, running services, software versions, and weak security settings. The scan reports each issue with severity, a description, and remediation steps, as you can see. And it does help the security teams overall to prioritize the risks and decide what needs fixing first. So here I provided just kind of a rundown of what I was seeing on my end when I ran the scan. As you can see, it had a bunch of information. It provided many different tabs, and it included descriptions and the remediation steps. At different tabs here, the hosts, the vulnerabilities, remediations, and the history as well. So the first vulnerability here that I chose to include was that it detected what was known as the unsupported PHP version that was running on the server, meaning it no longer receives security updates. This is considered very high risk, as you can see, because it may have unpatched security flaws that could allow attackers to take over the server. It also mentioned that it is serious risk since attackers wouldn't even need login credentials to take advantage of it. And the solution or remediation that was given here is to upgrade the PHP to a supported version, and then you can go ahead and retest the server to make sure that the vulnerability is actually fixed. So the scan here also showed me that the PHP version in use is below 7.3.24. So that makes it vulnerable to several security risks. Because the PHP version is outdated, the server is at high risk of the server being vulnerable to attacks targeting existing flaws. And the recommended solution here is to upgrade the PHP to at least the version 7.3.24 as soon as possible. Here I had the plugin 42423 detected, and this is a CGI generic SSI injection vulnerability, and this can leave room for attackers to exploit poorly sanitized SSI scripts to execute unauthorized commands on the server. This is very high risk, and it does recommend here to mitigate it by disabling the SSI or restricting access and applying the vendor patches. Next up, we have the plugin 11213 that found the HTTP trace and possibly track methods that are supported on the web server. So this is a medium risk issue because trace can support attacks like cross-site tracing, which can actually lead to exposing the session cookies or headers to an attacker. And the recommended mitigation here is disable the HTTP trace and track methods in the server configuration. So next up, I have the plugin 152853 that found the PHP version with of course, the lesson sign 7.3.28, which is vulnerable to multiple email header injection attacks. So basically, an unauthenticated attacker could exploit this by sending crafted requests that manipulate email headers, potentially gaining control over the email content. Here, the remediation steps are upgrading the PHP to 7.3.28 or newer to eliminate this risk. So the next one here is the plugin 17687 that was flagged that the PHP installation is vulnerable to a denial of service through its image processing functions. An attacker could exploit this by sending specially crafted images files, causing the PHP process to crash or overload, affecting availability. So even though it's not immediately about remote code execution, it's still a meaningful availability risk that we need to address. So next up here is that it detected a PHP's expose_PHP setting that is enabled, meaning that the server is broadcasting of version details and other internals. This information disclosure is a medium risk because attackers can use the version to identify specific exploits. The remediation here is, of course, disabling the expose_PHP and setting it to off, which is actually the php.ini, and then restarting the web server. So the scan here found that the site is missing key protections, so the X-frame options or the CSP frame ancestors against framing attacks. Without those headers, an attack could embed the page in an iframe and trick a user into clicking malicious controls, which is clickjacking risk. This is a medium level vulnerability and should be remediated by adding the appropriate headers in the web server configuration. Next up, I have the scan that identified the PHP is older than the version 4.4.2, which has multiple known XSS vulnerabilities. Because this PHP build is unpatched for those XSS issues, it presents a risk of client-side script attacks. So even though this is low in risk, it still warrants remediation, and basically it recommends to upgrade the PHP to 4.4.2 or later and ensure that there is a secure configuration. Alrighty, so the vulnerability number 10 here that was chosen was the web server transmits clear text credentials vulnerability, and this is the plugin 26194, and it tells us that the login form on the web server sends credentials in clear text over HTTP. So because the form uses unencrypted transmission, an attacker eavesdropping the traffic could steal the valid login credentials. We should also try to be mindful that we need to ensure that all authentication forms submit only over HTTPS. This will encrypt the credentials when it's in transit, and then it's actually going to reduce that risk. Next up here are the attack vectors. So basically, after all this information that I was able to compile, there are some attack vectors that I could keep in mind. So one of which is the web app injection. So considering the SQLI injection, so basically outdated web servers or input fields can lead to the data theft. Next up, there's the XSS and the CSRF. Again, here is the poor input handling and absent of the token checks, which is going to lead into possible session takeover and forced requests. Next up is the privilege escalation. This one is just because there's poorly configured sudo or SUID bits that's actually churning into an immediate path for the attacker to gain those root privileges. And the last attack vector I chose here are the weak credentials. So this is basically having the unchanged or simple passwords on services, and that's going to actually lead into an easy compromise. So from the findings, I am hypothesizing that the web app likely is neglecting to validate user input, creating an SQL injection path. And malicious inputs can be executed by the database to leak data or occasionally trigger OS commands. So being able to safely test with arrow probes, fuzzing, and read-only queries. If vulnerable, sanitize inputs, use the parameterized statements, limit the database privileges, and monitor queries. Now here I will be discussing the SQL injection and basically the selected vulnerability root cause. So according to BANAC 2025, SQL injection is only possible when an unsanitized user input is directly embedded into dynamically constructed SQL queries. So overall, it occurs when inputs from users are executed as part of the SQL queries without proper escaping or validation. The results can be from input validation being absent, inadequate quoting practices, insufficient parameterized queries, and this is according to BANAC 2025. Now, lastly here, when it comes to the responsibility of cybersecurity professionals like ourselves, we have to keep in mind that when we're disclosing vulnerabilities or we're dealing with data in general or we're running tests, there is that importance of considering the legal, ethical, and industry standards that come with this. So in the legal aspect, revealing vulnerabilities or even performing these tests without the permissions needed can break laws similar to the CFAA. It can also break laws such as the privacy laws. So this could be HIPAA, this could be the CCPA, the GDPR. And then next up, there's also those ethical considerations. So we do need to be mindful that we need to do actions that are avoiding harm to others. So being mindful of that and being also responsible with the information we're disclosing as well. Next up is the industry standards, or basically the best security practice that we can perform as cybersecurity professionals to make sure that we are doing our part to being responsible and making sure we're adhering to those industry standards. A few of this is basically the ISO /IEC 29147 is a good one, and also the remediation that we're doing is part of this as well. And of course, having that tracking and monitoring to make sure that we're keeping track of everything as we go along.